Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Massey College for our afternoon closing session of our session on the Unwritten Constitution. Before I call on Tom Axley to introduce our closing speaker, I'm just delighted that today we've been joined by a number of prominent Canadians today, and I'm just delighted that just by chance to have in the neighborhood pop by for our session the parliamentary assistant to the Ontario Attorney General, my friend Brian Saunderson, who is the new MPP for Simcoe Grey. I'd just like him to stand, and if everyone could just say a warm welcome to MPP Saunderson. He was newly elected just this past June, and we're delighted to have him here for this afternoon session. I'd now like to call on Tom Axley to introduce our closing speaker. Tom, thank you for a great job today, and back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard, and delighted to have guests. So, ladies and gentlemen, in our last session of what's been a rich morning with many contending points of views and much illumination, I'm delighted to introduce Peter Biro, who is an old friend of Massey College and a warrior in the battle to secure democracy across the country. He is a student of political philosophy, became a very prominent lawyer and businessman. He has created a think tank, Section 1, devoted to preserving and promoting democratic institutions and values across the country. And I particularly wanted him to give us a keynote because in his own work with Section 1, previous to today, he has sponsored conferences on threats to democracy with a large section on populism. Being made that populism per se is not necessarily wrong, but extreme populism as practiced in many places is. And then here that was at the former Ryerson University. And then at Massey, he had a two-day conference on the notwithstanding clause. One of the speakers at that conference was with the panel today, Caitlin, who had a brilliant paper then and a very up-to-date presentation just a few moments ago. So this is an activist committed to the law, to democratic practice, to public education, and to Massey College. We couldn't have a better person to wrap up this colloque. Peter.
I don't. I've got
your mic.
I've got it. Thank you so much for that very, very kind introduction. Thank you for having me here. Thank you, Natalie, for hosting this and for all the work you do here. It's really an honor and a great pleasure to be at Massey and to share the agenda today with so many distinguished and insightful speakers. And although I won't mention the notwithstanding clause in my talk, we do have a volume coming out on the notwithstanding clause, and Tom actually has a wonderful chapter in it, and so does Caitlin. So I hope you will look for that when it comes out. Paul Krugman wrote in the New York Times last week that the people who will be running the House of Representatives for the next 2 years, a group, as far as anyone can tell, that does not include Kevin McCarthy, who seems set to be Speaker in name only, believe a number of untrue things. Many, perhaps most, believe that the 2020 election was stolen, or at least that Joe Biden is somehow not the legitimate president. Many believe that COVID vaccines do more harm than good, a belief that has contributed to thousands of excess deaths, especially amongst Republican partisans. Quite a few either subscribe to or are at least friendly to the beliefs of QAnon, a cult which claims that those run by a vast conspiracy of pedophiles. Republican strategist Doug Hay, speaking last week on CNN about Congressman George Santos, made the following statement: "You couldn't have gotten away with lying like this 5 or 6 years ago. Today you can lie and it doesn't matter." There's so many norms and conventions to which we adhere in a liberal constitutional democracy. Some arise out of law, some flow from moral or ethical precepts, some are matters of tradition, and still others are just rituals. However we classify them and understand their origins, they all both inform and reinforce the civic culture of liberal constitutionalism domestically and throughout the world. A minister of the Crown resigns her cabinet because she was caught awarding a government contract to a friend. A prime minister calls on the governor seeking a dissolution of Parliament in the wake of a lost confidence vote in the House of Commons, although he might have avoided that fate altogether by preemptively proroguing Parliament. The incumbent government leader concedes defeat in an election and facilitates the peaceful transfer of power to her successor. A presidential candidate discloses his tax returns. A finance minister takes pains to avoid directing the governor of the central bank on monetary policy. A senior civil servant remains neutral, as Patrice mentioned, in a political dispute over the communications between a minister of the Crown and the director of public prosecutions. A congressman resigns when past dishonorable conduct comes to light. These were a few examples of norms that in earlier times were thought to be de rigueur. Today I want to advance two propositions. The first is that among the several factors causally connected to the democratic backsliding occurring in the past decade throughout the West, the factor that is foundational to all of them is the erosion of truth as cardinal societal value, of which the departure from adherence to norms and conventions is derivative. The second proposition is that liberal democracy's vulnerability to the war on truth may in fact be so, and that it may be baked into early liberal epistemology. Canadian constitutional scholar Donald Burr tells us that the Constitution must be seen as that legal norm which is recognized by all as one according to its nature that demands obedience. I submit that that statement, qualified by the matter of enforceability, applies equally to those unwritten norms and conventions as much as to those that are codified in the written Constitution. They're those that, according to their nature, are recognized by all as demanding obedience. The Supreme Court of Canada, examining the closely interlocked relationship between law and convention, noted in the patriation reference case to which Tom referred earlier, that the purpose of convention is to ensure that the legal framework of the Constitution will be operated in accordance with the prevailing constitutional values or principles of the period. So perhaps prevailing constitutional values or principles have something to do with the claim that norms have on our obedience, or at least on those of our governments and their leaders. Constitutional convention is broadly understood as prescribing the way in which existing legal powers are to be exercised, as the uncodified conventions governing the manner in which the Governor General in Council discharges her duties as set out in the written Constitution. It's not always the case, however, that the written word precedes the convention. One could hardly point to a more obvious and important example of this than the convention that grounds all of Canadian constitutional democracy, namely that of responsible government. After all, it was Lord Durham who, having been tasked with discovering the underlying causes of the rebellions of 1837 and of their aftermath, determined that the true culprits were, in fact, the various sources of conflict between the assemblies and the executive councils, for which the structural remedy was to be the implementation of responsible government. In other words, Lord Durham identified what today we might understand as the democratic deficit in the system of political governance of the period, namely that without responsible government, political conflict and social disharmony would run rampant because executive councils were not comprised of persons who enjoyed a confidence of the majority of the assemblies. Thus was perhaps the most foundational of all Canadian constitutional conventions adopted here before the British North America Act was even conceived, let alone drafted. And like so much else of Canadian constitutional law, the Convention of Responsible Government, which is in truth a super convention comprising several discrete conventions, was not, of course, Lord Durham's brainchild, but rather a system that had previously evolved in the United Kingdom, designed as it was to regulate, or rather to resolve and harmonize the respective powers of the Crown and of the Parliament. But already we see in that foundational convention a set of constitutional values and principles that, when fully fleshed out, could establish the kinds of norms which, by their nature, demand obedience. In contrast to the adherence to and compliance with those norms which are set out in the written Constitution or which are codified in the positive law, convention, as Peter Hogg explained to us, many cannot be coerced or compelled or otherwise enforced in the courts. And so we come to understand that convention has such moral authority as to demand obedience without the requirement of any formal instrument of enforcement or coercion. Without expanding on this here, allow me simply to suggest that this moral authority, this persuasive force, is at the root of what we might call legitimacy. A meaningful position of this would find us rummaging around the intersection of moral philosophy, law, democratic theory, and social psychology. But for present purposes, indulge me, if you will, in my simplification and allow me to consider the connection between political legitimacy, that is the sense, in my formulation, of a generally held public conviction in the morally and politically obligatory nature of certain norms, on the one hand, and what I refer to as society's shared epistemic foundation, that is, the societal or collective deference to the authority of facts, truth, and knowledge. What Burr says about legal norms and constitutional norms, namely that they're those which are recognized by all as demanding obedience according to their nature, can broadly be said about political norms in general. What interests us is the extent to which certain norms, conventions, and rituals, if you will, are considered to be de rigueur because they're reflective of a broadly accepted political code. In those cases, departures from such norms are viewed as intolerable breaches of that code rather than as being merely gauche. Today, it's commonplace for democratic theorists, civil libertarians, political observers, and commentators alike to decry the democratic backsliding that's been occurring, especially in so-called liberal democracies throughout the West. The leading contributing factors, as you know, and I'll just rhyme through a few of them, include exponentially increasing economic inequality, both as to income gaps and also as to wealth disparities. The failure of political parties to effectively discharge their filtration and gatekeeping functions, out aspiring autocrats and those otherwise unfit for political office in a liberal constitutional system of government. The dysfunctionality of the legislatures, the gridlock, the inefficiency and general tone of incivility that inhabits them, contributing to popular cynicism about the political process. And Patrice had also referred to the decline of trust in general, trust in government. Right-wing populism's challenge to multi-ethnic, multicultural demographics and its exploitation and weaponization of grievance, disenchantment, and prejudice. Left-wing groupthink and its imposition of ideologically driven purity tests on speech, including, Madame Principal, here in the Academy. The Internet's fragmentation of discourse and consequential supremacy of the chamber as structural barrier to consensus generation across partisan and ideological lines, unmediated as it is by the traditional truth and knowledge seekers and by the traditional curators of our political narratives. And of course, the one that's nearest and dearest to my heart, the failure of public education to teach civics, by which I mean, very simply, to educate our students and our citizens into the political culture of liberal constitutionalism. The result is a civic culture characterized by what Moïse Naim refers to as the 3 Ps: populism, polarization, and post-truth. And to those 3 Ps, I would add an E for extremism. Incidentally, Andrew Coyne recently had a very, very interesting op-ed on that and tried to distinguish America from Canada on the basis of the extremism that he says is actually quite instrumental in or potential decline of democracy here as compared to the polarization which is the dominant force in the United States. So this both leads to and flows from, in a sort of symbiotic strange loop, what I refer to as the mother of all factors in the phenomenon of democratic backsliding. And that's the multidimensional, multi-pronged war on and decline of truth. Think of how we've gone from the seemingly harmless phrase uttered by Anne Conway in 2016, alternative facts, concerning the crowd size in attendance at Trump's presidential inauguration, to outright election denialism in 2020 and beyond. Conway's phrase was really just the tip of a spear that would ultimately transect the vital organs of our body politic, compromising the very idea of truth, of its importance for and relevance to political force. We're seeing the consequences of that war on truth in living color today. And I want to posit that the most telltale signs of the progress and indeed the success of that multidimensional exercise in sabotage of our shared epistemic foundation are to be found in the widespread departure from norms and conventions that ground liberal constitutionalism as a collective, tacitly agreed upon political ideal system of government. It's the withering away of truth, of what Sir Karl Popper called objective knowledge. We don't have the time to get into philosophy of science here, but that's my code for an interesting argument all on its own, that makes permissible, indeed that has normalized, the departure from adherence to norms and conventions that we're observing throughout the world. When we first met Viktor Orban on stage, he emerged as a liberal reformer, as did Turkey's Erdogan. It didn't take long, however, before his autocratic inclinations and his illiberal ideals came to define Hungary's political evolution. In fact, Orban himself loudly and proudly referred to his brand of politics as illiberal democracy. But even illiberalism is merely a station on the Via Dolorosa of democratic backsliding. In fact, it's already so last season in some quarters. The European Parliament no longer even refers to Orban's Hungary as an illiberal democracy. Recently, they have referred to it, and without noticeable objection on Orban's part, as an electoral autocracy. So that's the new terminology. And what Orban and Erdogan and others have done, they've done more or less in plain sight. It's been a deft sleight of hand, a clever combination of selective departure from traditional liberal democratic norms to alteration of the underlying laws and institutions, all the while pretending that those norms themselves haven't changed. Hungary still has judges, just no judicial independence. An active and quite effective press, just not a free press. A parliament, but one that appears to answer to the prime minister rather than the other way around. Go on. A fine party trick of hucksterism and autocracy, all employing populist strategies, and more than anything else, using disinformation and gamesmanship with truth propositions to advance the regime's ends. And as we've witnessed in Washington and most recently in Brasilia and elsewhere, the citizenry itself can often be enlisted to do the regime's dirty work with potentially catastrophic consequences for liberal constitutionalism. And what is the instrument of that dirty work? A lie. A lie about an election result. A lie about the integrity of an otherwise sacrosanct political process. A refusal to concede a lost election and to participate honorably and publicly in the rituals that attend the peaceful transfer of power. Now, after Brasilia, it may become fashionable to thwart or to reverse the peaceful transfer of power by way of popular insurrection. That's what follows from norms no longer seen as demanding obedience. In the international arena, the basic assumptions that informed international law and institutions of global governance are no longer sacred and are not enforceable. Russia is proving that the Geneva Convention, a convention after all, and the generally accepted rules, norms, and conventions of war are all quite dispensable. We're back to naked aggression and raw power facilitated by lies. Diana Pankey and Ulrich Peterson have endeavored to explain why some formerly deeply embedded international norms, either incrementally or rapidly, as the case may be, lose their prescriptive status, and in the extreme can even cease to exist altogether. Why is it that some norms are replaced while others disappear? Norm degenerations, they argue, require the presence of actors who challenge the norm and the absence of central enforcement authorities or individual states that are willing and capable of punishing norm violations. Norm substitutions ensue providing that competing norms are present. If there are no competing norms, norms simply disappear without being replaced. And that is precisely what we're witnessing at the moment. Some of our institutions at home, as in the international arena, where are the actors willing and capable of punishing norm violations? Where are we? If, as the Supreme Court of Canada explained, the purpose of convention is to ensure that the legal framework of the Constitution will be operated in accordance with the then prevailing constitutional values or principles, it also stands to reason that the purpose of all political norms is to ensure that the policy will be governed in a manner that accords with the prevailing political and societal values and principles. And we can and should view a departure from adherence to those norms as both reflecting and, if we're looking for red flags, also foretelling a shift away from or an outright disintegration of established political and societal values themselves. In the Pankey-Peterson framework, we might understand flags as signaling a complete absence of competing norms, or to think of it somewhat differently, as the absence of an underlying shared narrative or shared epistemic foundation, so necessary to legitimize the long-standing hegemonic structure and constitutional architecture that informs the political process and gives rise to norms and conventions in the first place. When a president is impeached and then tried on the floor of the very institution constitutionally made to hold the executive branch accountable for serious transgressions of the basic law of the land, and that body conducts a proceeding, nay, a cynical ritual, which bears no resemblance to an exercise in public accountability, let alone to what we in the Western world might call a trial. And if in such an event no public outcry ensues, one's forced to ask, how can this be? What has changed between 1974, when the mere prospect of such a trial caused the resignation of a president, and 2020, when all the president's men quite effectively cast the actual defenders of the Constitution as enemies of the state? What's changed is that by 2020, the congressional leader of the president's party was no longer asking, what did the president know and when did he know it? And by 2023, he was credited, very president, with the outcome of the contest for the speaker's gavel, because the truth had become an intolerable inconvenience. Indeed, it had become an obstacle to power rather than a path to legitimacy. When a prime minister and his team opportunistically establish a non-criminal remedial stream known as a deferred prosecution agreement with a particular and highly influential corporate friend and potential defendant in mind, and then quite unambiguously proceed to pressure the most senior public official in the prosecutorial branch of government, someone in his cabinet, as a matter of fact, to exercise, my euphemism needless to say for forfeit, abdicate, or fetter, her discretion to make that deferred prosecution agreement available to the corporate friend as an alternative to criminal prosecution. And when doing this, the person who is cast out of government and of caucus is not the chief conspirator, but the chief prosecutor. Why? For having stood her ground, for having protected an essential norm of liberal constitutionalism, one that we refer to as prosecutorial independence. And when, after all of this, the country's ethics commissioner, an independent officer of parliament after all, finds that some egregious violations of ethics have been committed either by or on behalf of the prime minister, and yet the prime minister accepts no real responsibility for any ethical transgressions, and then proceeds to win another general election, albeit with only a modest plurality of the vote, what's going on in Canada? When a candidate for leader of a national political party that sits as the official in Parliament says that he is running for prime minister, and that when he takes office, he intends to fire the governor of the Bank of Canada, and when he is then elected party leader with an overwhelming majority of votes, how does one credibly challenge the claims that in Canada, party members in leadership contests don't actually vote for a prime minister, and neither prime ministers nor their finance ministers generally interfere with the discretion of the Bank of Canada governor, let alone fire them? What we see in these obviously, or at least seemingly, unrelated anecdotes is, I submit, the truth of as cardinal value, as universal reference point and authority in our discourse. We see truth being optional, dispensable as an element in our discourse. We see it losing its status as controlling or authority whenever it becomes an inconvenience. We're living in a confessional age. In an age in which we take an almost prurient interest in the details, particularly the sordid ones of other people's otherwise mundane lives. It's an age in which your story is fascinating and a matter of public interest simply because it is. It's an age in which your truth is valid simply because you say so. Your truth, my truth, her truth, their truth, a multiplicity of truths, each with a standing and a validity which is insulated from criticism because that validity is derived not from objectively demonstrable tests, but from their very fact of one's individual identity. We're living in a time when subjectivity has grounded and indeed elevated relativism in ways that were not, but ought to have been, not only imagined, but anticipated. The result? What I think of as a fragmentation of what I'll call, for today's purposes, the truthosphere, an evisceration of objective knowledge. How did this occur? Well, it's complicated, multiple factors, but if you'll tolerate my great leap backward through the ages, I want to suggest, without really having the opportunity to flesh this out the way it deserves to be examined, that the seeds of this epistemological fragmentation really can be traced back to the break that the early moderns made with the ancients on the matter of man's relationship to nature and with the natural world. From Plato, Aristotle to Aquinas, and right up to Hobbes in the 17th century, and perhaps as late as Locke, political philosophy sought to found efficient, harmonious, stable, and just political orders on a particular conception of nature, one that included human nature, and one that understood nature as embodying every ideal, including perfection in the human virtues as much as in the elements and in the ordering of the cosmos. Now, the distance between Plato is obviously enormous, both in time, in years, and also in their respective conceptions of human nature and of what justice itself entails, such as these were variously understood. But both adhered to the idea that man's nature and inclinations ought to be at least partly determinative of the sorts of societal arrangements that might attend a viable, if not an ideal, civil society. With Sir Francis Bacon, however, a contemporary of Hobbes and a one-time patron of Hobbes, we see a critical break from the ancients' reverence for nature as embodiment of and guide to all that is ideal, including in our societal arrangements, and a line of demarcation that's drawn between man and nature, such that man is seen as exerting mastery of and dominion over nature because man stands apart from nature rather than being very bound up in and with it. As an aside, I'd submit that this differs profoundly from the notion in the book of Genesis of dominion over every living thing that moves upon the earth, which in my reading is really a command to be good stewards of the earth. Although it is arguable that the injunction in Genesis to fill the earth and to subdue it actually does anticipate and what would follow with the early moderns. In all events, this break has had paradigm shifting and civilization bending implications for philosophy, for the science of matter, and for our understanding of reason. Pope Benedict XVI, who I assure you I am ordinarily not given to quoting for a whole host of reasons, in an impassioned and somewhat controversial, but I think insightful cri de coeur against the moral relativism era, referred to this development as what he called the de-Hellenization of reason. Of course, he was lamenting the break of reason from faith. But he was making a singularly astute point, namely that reason had become untethered from the idealism of the ancients, from the notion that truth and that nature, including human nature, is both embodiment and also repository of all truth. By the time we encounter the Tarians in the 18th and 19th centuries, we see an explicit repudiation of nature as the basis for a just and legitimate social order. As Waller Newell explains it, liberalism, in its utilitarian iteration, assumed that political authority was legitimized solely and self-evidently by its ability to promote the greatest material good for society. The critical factor in that repudiation was what, thanks to both Hume and later to Weber, came to be known as the fact-value distinction, which, as you know, posits that, contrary to the epistemology of the ancients, one cannot derive an ought from an is. And so any effort to advance normative propositions, including, of course, about how civil society ought to be ordered, will be the product of will, of power, of convenience, of ego, choice, and, of course, abstract reason, rather than of ideals discerned from nature's elucidation or from some immutable truths about man's basic psychology and natural inclinations. This de-Hellenization of reason, as it were, is finally perfected in contemporary liberal theory with a Rawlsian, John Rawls, great Harvard liberal philosopher of justice, positive justice that owes as much to Bacon's turn as it does to Kant's metaphysics of morals, and that separates and abstracts entirely the principles of reason, not only from nature generally, but from human nature specifically. And while Rawls, using a thought experiment he refers to as the veil of ignorance, devises principles of justice that aim to overcome our inclination for self-dealing, an unintended, perhaps inevitable byproduct of this total abstraction of reason from nature is the atomization and resulting fragmentation of truth statements about the world. In this wholly democratized universe, individual subjective truth statements no longer compete to the death for validation in the marketplace of ideas, but instead sit along other equally unassailable and irrefutable claims to validity. Forward now to real time, Ottawa, 1989, when the Supreme Court first considered equality rights in Andrews and the Law Society of British Columbia and decided that Section 15(1) of the Charter guarded against the effects of discrimination regardless of intent. The focus of the court's inquiry in establishing whether a measure was discriminatory and a violation of Section 15 rights should not on intent or broad purpose of the legislature or the government, said the court, but on grounds relating to personal characteristics of the individual or group, which would produce certain burdens or disadvantages on that individual or group not imposed on other members of society. This way of thinking was already embedded in human rights law and culture by that time. And in fact, even 4 years before Ontario Human Rights Commission and O'Malley and Simpson-Sears, followed in 1987 by Action Travail des Femmes and CNR, the Supreme Court established that a lack of intention is no defense to an allegation of discrimination. It was enough if the conduct had a discriminatory effect, and the focus should be on the impact the conduct had, the impact of the questionable behavior. This framework was given a wide intellectual berth and was allowed to become a sort of foundation stone for the modern human rights paradigm throughout the West, as a byproduct, if a remote one, of the conceptual door that had been opened by way of the fact-value distinction that I referred to earlier, which was in essence traceable back to the liberal break from the epistemology of the ancients. The effects-based analysis is, for its very considerable merits, ultimately derivative of an epistemology that divorces or untethers, if you will, truth propositions, especially those about human affairs, from universal statements about nature, including about the nature of human nature itself. What I want to suggest is that the seeds of relativism, and therefore of the fragmentation, you might want to call it the democratization of truth sources, has made possible a world in which truth as an ideal no longer commands universal regard and respect. Individual experience becomes an authoritative truth source in itself, and even achieves a kind of juridical standing in our human rights jurisprudence. And subjective judgment trumps objective knowledge. In this world that I describe, it is will, power, opportunity, circumstance, and fashion that dictate. And in this kind of world, I submit that it's not possible to speak intelligibly of norms which, according to their nature, demand obedience. If truth is losing its status and its authoritative value in social discourse, what then constitutes the factual baseline on which everyone stands before they take off madly in their respective directions? What constitutes the shared reality that supplies the factual justification for public choices and for political action? Rhetorical as the question obviously is, the answer nevertheless bears articulating. If truth is not the basis of the factual assumptions on which policies are advanced and action taken, then of course the basis must be some form of untruth. When Putin stands before the cameras and declares that Ukraine is in the grips of a Nazi leadership, that it harbors ambitions to de-Russify not only the Donbass, but possibly Russia itself. When he declares that reports of war crimes, of terrible atrocities in Bucha are all based on fake information. We recognize easily enough the purpose of such lies. We see the justificatory connection between the propaganda and the war mobilization. On this side of the pond, when Trump, anticipating his loss at the polls, spends months in advance of the election undermining the integrity of the electoral process and warning that election fraud is in the offing, and when he then predictably loses the election and claims that in fact he won it, we see the justificatory connection between the lies and the attempted insurrection. But in America, in the Putin example, we're aware of the machinery of government enlisted not merely to promote the lies and prevent the truth from being disseminated, but also of the coercive power of the state in service of enforcement of the regime of deception and of punishment of those who transgress the laws that make truth-seeking and truth-speaking crimes. In America, however, there's no such comparable state-enforced coercive regime established for the purpose of promoting election denialism and punishing truth-telling. And yet millions of Americans believe and were prepared to act upon obvious, demonstrably unsupportable lies and falsehoods. In America, untruth, all on its own, without the backing of corrupt prosecutors, without the fear and dread of all-inclusive vacations in remote penal colonies, is sufficient to bring about chaos and to instill doubt in the minds of millions about the integrity of the political order and indeed of the Constitution itself. In Plato's Republic, in a sort of Phoenician parable known as the myth of the metals, Socrates describes a socially stratified society as a metaphor for the soul. The myth of the metals is basically this idea that some people's souls are mingled with iron, some with bronze, some with silver, and some with gold, and that the metal with which you are mingled determines your place in society. In truth, of course, there's no metal in your body. If there is, you should call 911, not your local philosopher, not your rabbi. Socrates, believing that certain complex ideas could not be understood by all, justified the use of this myth, of this noble lie, to advance the cause of the good and just society. I would note parenthetically that as good liberal constitutionalists, we view Plato's device with horror, predicated as it is on the notion that, paraphrasing Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men, people can't handle the truth, and therefore must tell them stories so that they'll rally in solidarity behind their wise and benevolent philosopher king, who advocated a form of class and caste system. Sir Karl Popper saw this for what it was, namely the way to totalitarianism. But Plato really did mean well. Nevertheless, the noble lie, as a rhetorical device, endeavors, or at least purports, communicate through the vehicle of story some essential truth. It's the imparting of truth through the means of a particular literary device employed for a legitimate societal purpose and benefit. Out-and-out lies, on the other hand, that are designed to deceive are in a fundamental sense fraud. They do not aim either literally, metaphorically, or symbolically to convey truth. They dissemble, they distort, and they distract from truth and fact. Their aim is neither to enrich the soul nor to fortify the civic spirit. They serve only the interests of power, not those of knowledge or truth, and most certainly not those of enlightened self-government. How else to understand the Republican leadership's silence in the face of a newly elected congressman's wholly fabricated curriculum vitae? What does truth matter when the balance of power and the House speakership might depend on vote? When in the aftermath of the 2020 presidential election, half the Republican establishment looked away while the other half was more or less complicit in the multi-pronged attempt to overturn a presidential election, we understand that not even lies matter. For the point is not that the known truth is actually denied. The point is that people often do know the truth, but no longer feel bound to defer to it, to give it the stand it must have for a consensus-generating constitutional democracy to function as such. That's the level of cynicism and corrosiveness at work here. The war on truth is prosecuted in many ways, some quite subtle and some even quite benign and inadvertent. Let's consider the following well-meaning statements by our current Prime Minister. Our diversity is what unites us. Today, as has been the case for centuries, we are strong, not in spite of our differences, but because of them. In an op-ed at the time, Tony Keller commented by saying that Canada's diversity is a fact. Canada's unity as a liberal democratic society built on a diverse population is an act. In that same speech, Trudeau went on to say, ours is a land of Indigenous peoples, settlers and newcomers, and our diversity has always been at the core of our success. Canada's history is built on countless instances of people uniting across their differences to work and thrive together. In quite correctly stating that Canada's history is built on people having united across their differences, Trudeau inadvertently contradicts his earlier statements and Keller's point. It's the act of uniting across their differences rather than the differences themselves that make us stronger. Populism, as Jan Werner Müller taught us, begins with a natural hostility to pluralism. And history and social science teach us that homogeneous societies are far more resilient, more internally stable and cohesive than heterogeneous ones. In truth, Canada would be more united if it didn't have to contend with Quebec's distinctness, its nationalism, its different understanding of secularism, if it didn't have to deal with Western alienation and regional economic and resource disparities, if it didn't have to respond to the claims of Indigenous peoples to sovereignty over their own affairs and to their own unfettered stewardship of lands and natural resources currently under the Crown's dominion, and if it didn't have to contend with the very passionate and consequential narratives about its colonial past. But Canada does, in fact, have to contend with these realities. Arguably, Trudeau's statement is intended to instill in the citizenry a shared idealization of diversity in order to produce a condition of social harmony. The problem, of course, is not that this is an ignoble lie, as much as it is a form of well-intended gaslighting. So what's the big deal? What's really at stake? It's that untruth, the same sort of untruth, by the way, that's led to the cancellation recently of Canada's first Prime Minister and founder, is not harmless. It's telling a reasonably smart and sensible population that what many people naturally experience and feel and observe is not actually occurring, thereby promoting not a sense of unity and higher purpose, but rather one of insanity and guilt. And it's enlisting the cooperation and resolve of a people on the basis of an erroneous theory, or at a minimum, a grave sociological misunderstanding. Even the most seemingly innocuous and benign of untruths can impede a society's ability to achieve consensus on grand and difficult projects. You can't fix a big problem if you don't understand or have been misled as to the true nature of the problem in the first place. When the sands of truth upon which truth propositions are erected shift and retreat with every tide, when it seems as though each new wave coming ashore does not merely challenge discrete truth statements, but discredit the tried, tested, and shared epistemic foundation on which they are predicated, we would be delusional or willfully blind not to expect the norms and actions whose purpose and logic depend on the integrity of that epistemic foundation to become optional, or worse, to become just plain silly. U.S. Congressman Adam Schiff recently wrote, "Even the Constitution cannot protect us if the people sworn to uphold it do not give meaning to their oath of office. If that oath is not informed by ideas of right and wrong, and if people are unwilling to accept the basic truth of things." I would add to Schiff's statement that if people are unwilling to accept the basic truth of things, it is axiomatic that there will no longer be any norms which, according to their nature, are capable of demanding obedience. But there's still reason for hope and cause for renewed resolve in our defense of liberal constitutional democracy, sometimes in the most surprising of places. There are still those for whom basic truths form convention and supply it with requisite logic, coherence, and justification, even when the result involves personal sacrifice and inconvenience. Just yesterday, an advisor to Ukrainian President Zelensky offered his resignation after he suggested that the rocket that hit an apartment block in Dnipro 2 days ago was downed by Ukraine. Said Alexei Arestovich, I wrote a letter of resignation. I want to set an example of civilized behavior. A fundamental mistake means resignation. Perhaps the reinforcement and rehabilitation of those sorts of norms will require that liberal constitutionalism re-examine the ancient roots of its own epistemology, perhaps returning to Hobbes and revisiting the quite unforeseen implications of Bacon's fateful course change for what would set us on the path to the quite eventual and quite yet inescapable consequence of relativism's displacement of truth as cardinal value, as objective baseline for democracy's discourse. Thank you.
You've got some time for questions if there.
Oh, sure, if there are.
We have to give you the mic later, so you're on.
Thanks very much to my namesake, Peter. With some hesitation, I'll sort of bring a military, police, national security piece to this. 2015, before Trump was elected, with Obama still in office, I was invited to a very small group of individuals from the Five Eyes countries, UK, USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, 3 representatives from the policing level, 3 representatives from the national security level, and 3 military level officials. And we were given a very simple question. What is the greatest threat to the world, particularly democracies, in the next 5 years? Police got together at a table and we came up with domestic terrorism, particularly lone wolf act who could activate and harm people very quickly. National security got together and talked about the funding through transnational organized crime that funded both terrorism and crime. And the military came back very quickly and said, it is the death of truth. 5 minutes later, we all agreed on that. Death of truth.
I concur.
Are you surprised?
No, I concur. I think that was a comment and a well-considered one.
But no, not
Yep.
the death of truth.
Very good.
There wasn't a question there, it was just
Yeah.
a validation.
Comment. Any other questions or comments before we end our sessions today? Anybody else like to?
I've had discussions lately along this issue.
the
But
mic.
if you take the truth question, practically do in Canada today to try to get that into the minds of the young people so that we start to inculcate an appreciation for truth and civil service to the community and involvement that used to be part of our liturgy that we grew up with,
Yeah.
but it seems to be sadly missing. And if we don't address that, how are we going to solve the problem you're talking about?
Look, there are people in this room who devote themselves to the answer to that question. You know, people who are involved in educating our young people and our not so young people along the way. I mean, it is education, right? It's the,
They're dealing with the wrong group. They've got to start dealing with the 3, 5, 6, 7-year-olds
no,
rather than the 18,
without
19, 20-year-olds.
without a doubt. My view of civics education is that it has to begin at the very beginning. It can't be just some non-compulsory course in, the second year of high school. No, I mean, the problem is that the people teaching have already, been impoverished in some way. I mean, they're not in a position to impart what the sorts of values and critical thinking that I think is required, and to inculcate, to your word, the core values of liberal constitutionalism. That unlike the values that underpin many other political systems and ideologies, actually have a certain kind of, and again I'm going to use the word people hate, epistemological integrity and scientific integrity. There's a connection, if you're a lover of philosophy, between a certain kind of education and our understanding of, as opposed to education that is directed at implementing a particular agenda or achieving a particular political purpose. Not that that's always a bad thing either, right? But education is the answer, and it's going to take a lot of smart people to get to the bottom of how we respond to this. I mean, this is a problem that has to be fought at every turn. Maria Ressa, who was here not that long, devoted her life to it from one particular perspective as a journalist, who, by the way, today I was pleased to read, finally won her case, her trial in the Philippines. So the answer is too complex for some kind of facile comment on my part, but it's the right question. And we all need to devote ourselves to reflecting on this and to trying to do something about it. And to generating some kind of societal consensus on how to address this. Because it is, as Peter slowly said, it's the fundamental problem
Good.
for all of democracy.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Excellent conclusion. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending the colloque. Thanks to the principal for allocating the time so we can have our policy sessions. Again, thanking Alyssa and Joe and all the staff, David Slowly and Howard Brown, for helping bring these sessions come alive. Our next one is the student-led symposium on energy transitions and the dialectic between our desire for sustainability and the national and international interest in providing energy to allies who are requesting it almost every day. It's a fascinating policy problem, and the students at Massey and at Monk are going to take it on, and that is on March 24th. So thank you all very much, and the truth shall make us free.